Derry, New Hampshire was the kind of town where neighbors waved at each other from their driveways, where people left their doors unlocked, trusting in the quiet predictability of suburban life. But on the evening of May 1st, 1990, that sense of security was shattered. The house at 4 Misty Morning Drive, a modest condominium shared by newlyweds Greggory and Pamela Smart, had become a crime scene. The front door stood ajar, a faint breeze shifting the curtains inside. A few feet beyond the threshold, the body of 24-year-old Greggory Smart lay motionless on the floor, a pool of blood seeping into the beige carpet beneath his head. Pamela Smart, dressed in a tailored skirt and blazer, her usual work attire, stood frozen in the doorway, her briefcase slipping from her grasp. Her breath came in short, uneven gasps as she absorbed the horrific scene. The television in the living room was still on, casting a flickering glow over the walls. Nothing in the house appeared ransacked. The stereo, the VCR, all their electronics were still there. It didn't look like a robbery gone wrong. It looked personal. She stumbled back, reaching for the phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed 911. The dispatcher's voice was calm, measured, but Pamela's words were frantic, breaking apart between panicked sobs. "My husband! He's been shot! Oh, God, please! Someone help!" She couldn't say much else. The dispatcher kept her on the line, instructing her to stay outside until the police arrived. Within minutes, the sound of sirens pierced the quiet evening air. Red and blue lights bathed the street as the first patrol car screeched to a halt in front of the Smart residence. Officers moved in swiftly, weapons drawn, eyes scanning for immediate threats. It didn't take long to determine that whoever had been in the house was long gone. All that remained was the victim and his shattered skull. Detective Paul Maggiotto arrived shortly after the initial officers, his years of experience telling him that something about this crime scene wasn't quite right. Robberies gone wrong didn't usually look like this. They were messy. There were signs of forced entry, of struggle. This question mark. This was too clean. The placement of Greggory's body, the undisturbed surroundings, the absence of any real signs of confrontation, it didn't sit well with him. Pamela was still outside, arms wrapped around herself, shivering despite the mild spring air. Her large brown eyes were red-rimmed, swollen from tears. She was young, attractive, well put together. Not the image of a grieving widow curled up in agony, but instead standing upright, composed. Maggiotto had seen a lot of death notifications, a lot of genuine grief. This reaction? It was different, controlled, calculated. One of the officers guided her to a patrol car where she sat in the passenger seat, hands shaking against her lap. "Mrs. Smart, do you know of anyone who would want to hurt your husband?" The question was standard, a routine starting point, but Pamela's reaction was oddly delayed. "No," she whispered. "I don't know why anyone would do this." The statement was simple, but the way she said it felt off. Not the kind of gut-wrenching disbelief most people had when they lost a loved one so suddenly. No immediate protest of, "He didn't have enemies." No panicked insistence of, "It had to be a mistake." Just a flat, hollow denial. Inside the house, forensic technicians got to work. Greggory's body lay near the threshold, his head tilted unnaturally to the side. The fatal gunshot wound was clear, execution style, a single bullet to the head. Not the erratic gunfire of a panicked burglar, but a deliberate shot meant to kill. Blood spatter patterns indicated he had been standing when he was shot, then collapsed where he lay. There were no defensive wounds on his hands, no sign he had tried to fight back. Maggiotto's unease deepened. If this had been a robbery, why hadn't Greggory struggled? If he had walked in on a burglar, wouldn't there be some sign of an altercation? But everything remained in place, undisturbed, as if the killer had known they wouldn't need to search for anything of value. Pamela was taken to the station for further questioning. It wasn't an arrest, just routine procedure. But as she sat in the sterile interview room, sipping from a styrofoam cup of water, she didn't seem like a woman whose world had just collapsed. She was emotional, yes, but not inconsolable. She answered questions, but never offered anything beyond what was asked. She didn't speculate on what might have happened, didn't ask for updates, didn't beg for someone to find her husband's killer. Majoto watched her closely. Most grieving spouses wanted to know everything. They clung to every detail, desperate for answers. But Pamela? Pamela was different. It was almost as if she already knew. The investigation into Greggory Smart's murder escalated rapidly, drawing the full attention of the Derry Police Department. The crime scene was carefully examined, and forensic experts worked methodically to piece together the sequence of events. Blood spatter analysis confirmed that Greggory had been shot at close range. The lack of defensive wounds suggested that he had either been taken by surprise or had trusted the person who had confronted him. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, only a single fatal gunshot wound to the head. Detective Maggiotto and his team began constructing a timeline of Greggory's final hours. Interviews with colleagues at his insurance job revealed nothing out of the ordinary. He had left work at the usual time, made no mention of meeting anyone unusual, and had given no indication that he felt threatened. His financial records showed no signs of distress, no sudden withdrawals or unusual transactions. By all appearances, he was living a routine, stable life. Attention shifted to the one person who would have had intimate knowledge of his schedule, Pamela Smart. The young widow, still in shock but cooperating, was brought in for another round of questioning. Investigators noted her composed demeanor. While emotional, she never completely broke down. It was a stark contrast to what Maggiotto had seen in similar cases. The loss of a spouse in such a violent manner typically led to inconsolable grief, an uncontrollable outpouring of emotion. But Pamela maintained a remarkable level of control. The initial questioning covered standard inquiries: her whereabouts at the time of the murder, Greggory's behavior in the days leading up to it, and whether he had mentioned any concerns about personal safety. Pamela provided clear, concise answers, but there was an odd absence of speculation on her part. Most spouses, even in shock, would try to make sense of the situation, attempting to rationalize why someone would commit such an act. But Pamela never offered theories or expressed desperation for justice. Investigators dug deeper into her background. A promising young professional, Pamela worked as a media coordinator at Winnicott High School. She had a polished presence, spoke with confidence, and exuded ambition. Friends and colleagues described her as driven, someone who aspired to success beyond the life she had in Derry. They spoke of her relationship with Greggory as a typical young marriage, one with its ups and downs, but nothing that stood out as alarming. Yet there were undercurrents of dissatisfaction. A few acquaintances mentioned that Pamela had confided in them about feeling trapped, about wondering if she had married too young. While nothing pointed directly to troubles severe enough to suggest murder, investigators noted these details for further scrutiny. The forensic team completed their examination of Greggory's body. The bullet wound was clean, precise. Ballistics testing indicated that the firearm used was a .38 caliber handgun, a common weapon but not one found in the Smart household. This was significant. Whoever had committed the crime had access to a gun, but Greggory had not owned one himself. A check of local firearm sales and stolen weapon reports yielded no immediate matches. Investigators then turned to Greggory's social circle. Friends, family, and co-workers were questioned about any possible disputes, debts, or conflicts he might have had. No enemies emerged. He was well-liked, regarded as kind and responsible. Nothing in his past suggested that he had been involved in dangerous activities or had any reason to be targeted for a random execution. Attention returned to Pamela, but this time, the focus was on her personal life beyond the marriage. Detectives began hearing whispers about a student at Winnicott High School, someone young, impressionable, and connected to Pamela in ways that raised eyebrows. It started as a quiet murmur, a name mentioned in passing, but soon the same name appeared in multiple conversations. Billy Flynn. The revelation shifted the course of the investigation. The idea that a teacher could be involved in an inappropriate relationship with a student was scandalous enough. But if that relationship had any connection to the murder, it would elevate the case to an entirely new level. Detectives pursued this lead discreetly, speaking to students and staff at the school. Initially, responses were vague, hesitant. No one wanted to make accusations. But as the questioning continued, patterns emerged. A few students described seeing Pamela and Flynn spending time together in ways that seemed excessive for a normal teacher-student interaction. A select group of friends whispered about Flynn bragging about a special connection with an older woman. Most dismissed it as teenage boasting, but in light of recent events, it took on a more sinister meaning. Flynn himself was soon identified as someone who had been deeply affected by Pamela's presence in his life. Described as quiet, impressionable, and eager for approval, he fit the profile of someone who could be easily manipulated. Investigators dug into his background, seeking to understand what had drawn him into Pamela's orbit. He wasn't a troublemaker, nor did he have a history of violence. His grades were decent, his record clean. But what stood out was the way he spoke about Pamela to his close friends. Admiration bordering on obsession. As detectives worked to build a clearer picture, another crucial lead emerged. An anonymous tipster, later revealed to be a student close to Flynn, called the police with a chilling claim: Billy had confessed to being involved in Greggory Smart's murder. The caller, initially reluctant to say more, provided enough details to make it clear that Flynn knew something no ordinary person would. He had spoken about the crime before news reports had shared certain details, implying firsthand knowledge. The tip was a turning point. Detectives knew they had to move quickly. Flynn was brought in for questioning, his demeanor alternating between nervous energy and forced calmness. Unlike Pamela, he wasn't as composed under pressure. The more questions they asked, the more cracks appeared in his story. He denied involvement, but struggled to maintain consistency. He contradicted himself when asked where he had been the night of the murder. His body language betrayed discomfort. Fidgeting hands, avoiding direct eye contact, shifting in his seat. Detectives pressed further, sensing that Flynn wasn't acting alone. They knew they needed more than suspicion. They needed evidence. And so a plan was put in motion. One that would turn the course of the investigation from speculation to undeniable proof. Detectives knew that Billy Flynn was their key to unraveling the mystery surrounding Greggory Smart's murder. The young teenager had already shown signs of nervousness, his initial statements riddled with inconsistencies. But they needed more than a hunch. They needed a confession, physical evidence, or a direct link between him and the crime scene. With mounting pressure from the public and local media, investigators intensified their efforts. They started by focusing on Flynn's immediate social circle. Teenagers, when involved in something serious, rarely acted alone and rarely kept secrets. Sure enough, within days, additional names surfaced: Patrick Randall, Vance Latham Jr., and Raymond Fowler. Each of these young men had been seen with Flynn around the time of the murder, and all had known ties to each other. It was a small group, but the kind that had its own hierarchy. Flynn was at the center of it, but he wasn't acting alone. Detectives played their next move carefully. They didn't immediately bring in all four suspects at once. Instead, they started with the weakest link, someone they believed would break under pressure. Raymond Fowler was the most emotionally fragile of the group. While Flynn exuded a brooding intensity, and Randall carried himself with an air of bravado, Fowler had the demeanor of someone easily influenced. Fowler was brought in for questioning in a controlled but strategic manner. Detectives deliberately avoided any direct accusations at first, opting instead to weave a conversation that made it seem as though they already knew everything. They asked leading questions about his whereabouts, whom he had spoken to, what he had heard. The strategy worked. Within minutes, Fowler started to stumble, contradicting himself when asked to recount the night of the murder. He claimed he had been at home, but his timeline didn't add up. When confronted with subtle but deliberate inconsistencies, his resolve crumbled. Fowler didn't fully confess, not yet, but he gave investigators exactly what they needed: confirmation that Billy Flynn and Patrick Randall had been acting strangely in the days leading up to the murder. He mentioned overhearing conversations, whispers about taking care of things, and, most notably, a reference to a woman, someone who had influenced the decision to commit the crime. It was the opening detectives needed. With this information, they moved on to Vance Latham Jr. Unlike Fowler, Latham was more calculated. He was the son of a respected local figure, a teenager who had never been in serious trouble before. He thought he could outsmart the police, answering questions with vague responses and insisting he had nothing to do with any crime. But detectives had an advantage. They already knew about his father's firearm. The murder weapon, a .38 caliber handgun, had been traced back to Latham Sr., a respected and law-abiding citizen who had no reason to use the gun himself. When confronted with this revelation, Latham Jr. hesitated for the first time. His confidence faltered, and investigators seized the moment. They painted a picture of the situation he was in. Either he cooperated or he faced the full weight of the law. Under pressure, Latham Jr. admitted that he had provided the gun, but he insisted he hadn't pulled the trigger. He claimed that Flynn had been the one to actually commit the murder, with Randall acting as backup. He described the plan in chilling detail, how Flynn had been coaxed into believing he was carrying out a mission of love, how he had been manipulated into thinking he was protecting someone he cared about. That someone was Pamela Smart. Detectives now had enough information to act on their primary suspect. They knew Pamela had been involved, but they needed more than testimony from impressionable teenagers. They needed undeniable proof that she had orchestrated the crime. So they turned to a new strategy: surveillance. Pamela, unaware that investigators were closing in, continued living her life as though nothing had happened. She still went to work, still carried herself with the poise and confidence that had initially drawn suspicion. But behind the scenes, detectives were quietly assembling their case. They tapped into her social circle, monitoring her conversations and interactions. They wanted to know if she would slip up, if, in a moment of misplaced confidence, she would say something incriminating. Their patience paid off. One of Pamela's close acquaintances, Cecilia Pierce, was approached by detectives. A student intern and confidant of Pamela, Cecilia had been privy to conversations that now carried enormous weight. At first she was hesitant, reluctant to betray someone she admired. But as detectives pressed her, making it clear that withholding information could implicate her as well, she started to waver. Finally, they asked the critical question: had Pamela Smart ever spoken about wanting her husband dead? Cecilia hesitated. Then she answered, yes. With this revelation, detectives devised a plan. Cecilia would wear a wire during her next meeting with Pamela. They needed a direct admission, something that could eliminate any doubt. If Pamela had truly played a role in her husband's murder, they needed her to confirm it in her own words. The next meeting between Cecilia and Pamela was carefully arranged. Investigators monitored the interaction from a distance, their equipment capturing every word. At first, the conversation was casual, nothing out of the ordinary. But then Pamela started to talk about the ongoing investigation. She mentioned how the police were getting close, how certain people needed to keep quiet. She didn't explicitly confess, but she implied enough. The final moment came when Cecilia, pushing gently, asked what would happen if someone spoke to the police. Pamela's response was chilling. If they do, we're all going to rot. That was it. That was the moment detectives had been waiting for. Within hours, an arrest warrant was prepared. The walls were closing in on Pamela Smart, and this time, there would be no escaping the consequences of what she had set in motion. The evidence against Pamela Smart was mounting, but the detectives knew they needed to strike at the right moment. The audio recording from Cecilia Pierce was damning, yet not an outright confession. Pamela had been careful with her words, never directly admitting to orchestrating her husband's murder. However, the implication was clear. She knew more than she was letting on. With the pressure building, the police moved swiftly, determined to secure the final pieces of their case. The next step was confronting Billy Flynn. The 15-year-old had been avoiding any direct admissions, but his co-conspirators were already breaking down. Vance Latham Jr. had admitted to providing the murder weapon. Raymond Fowler had described his discomfort with what had transpired. Patrick Randall had remained silent, but his name was now firmly linked to the crime. Flynn was running out of options. Detectives brought him into the interrogation room, this time taking a different approach. Instead of immediately pressing him for a confession, they painted a vivid picture of his future. They told him about the life sentence he would face, the bleak reality of a maximum security prison. He wasn't a career criminal. He was a kid, barely able to comprehend the gravity of what he had done. The interrogation room was sterile, the fluorescent lights casting sharp shadows across the walls. Flynn sat with his arms crossed, his jaw tight. He wanted to hold out, to resist the pressure, but the detectives had perfected their craft. They let the silence stretch, allowing his own thoughts to turn against him. Then they played their final card. You think Pamela Smart is going to protect you? one of the detectives asked, leaning forward. You think she's worried about you right now? Because I'll tell you who she's worried about, herself. Flynn's bravado cracked. He shifted in his chair, his fingers tapping nervously against the table. She's already making sure you take the fall for this, the detective continued. She's out there, living her life, while you sit in here about to throw yours away for her. The seed of doubt had been planted. Flynn had believed he was acting out of love, that Pamela had truly cared for him. But now he was being forced to confront the reality. He had been used. The tension in the room was suffocating. Flynn's breathing grew heavier. He glanced toward the door as if considering an escape that wasn't there. Then finally his voice broke through the silence. She said she couldn't divorce him, Flynn muttered. She said it would ruin her. She said the only way we could be together was if he was gone. It was the confession detectives had been waiting for. From that moment on, the case against Pamela Smart was no longer circumstantial. She had manipulated Flynn into believing he was committing murder for love, when in reality, he was just a pawn in her carefully constructed scheme. But Flynn's confession wasn't enough. The prosecution wanted to ensure they had every detail locked in, every inconsistency accounted for. Flynn was asked to recount the entire plan, step by step. He hesitated at first, but once he started talking, the story poured out. Pamela had orchestrated everything. She had given specific instructions on when and how the murder should take place. She had warned them not to make it look like an obvious hit, to stage it as a burglary. She had even told them which doors would be unlocked. With Flynn's full confession, the case against Pamela Smart was complete. Prosecutors were prepared to charge her with conspiracy to commit murder and being an accomplice to first-degree murder. The arrest was imminent. At 8:20 a.m. on August 1st, 1990, detectives arrived at Pamela Smart's workplace. She was in her office at Winnicott High School when they entered, their presence immediately commanding attention. Students and staff watched as the young, charismatic media coordinator was led out in handcuffs, her expression unreadable. The moment Pamela Smart was placed in the back of the police car, her fate was sealed. What had started as a calculated plan to free herself from an unhappy marriage had spiraled into a nationwide scandal. She had believed she could control everything, that she was smarter than everyone else. But now as the weight of reality settled upon her, she realized the truth. She had lost. Pamela Smart's arrest sent shockwaves through Derry and beyond. The case had already gripped the town, but now it was making headlines nationwide. A young, attractive school employee accused of seducing a teenager into murdering her husband. It was the kind of scandal that the media feasted on. Cameras lined the courthouse steps, reporters dissected every new detail, and the public followed each development with morbid fascination. Prosecutors wasted no time in assembling their case. They had everything they needed: confessions from Billy Flynn and his accomplices, testimony from Cecilia Pierce, forensic evidence confirming the crime scene had been staged. The prosecution's goal was simple: prove that Pamela Smart was the mastermind, the one who had orchestrated the entire plot. Pamela, now behind bars, maintained her innocence. She insisted she had nothing to do with Greggory's murder, that she had been unfairly targeted, that the teenage boys were lying to save themselves. Her defense team crafted a narrative that painted her as a victim, claiming that Flynn had acted on his own out of a twisted obsession. But the evidence against her was overwhelming. When jury selection began in March 1991, it was clear that this would be no ordinary trial. The courtroom was packed with journalists, legal analysts, and spectators eager to witness what was being called the trial of the decade. News networks provided daily updates, turning the case into a real-life drama. The prosecution opened with a powerful statement, laying out how Pamela Smart had manipulated a vulnerable teenager, convincing him that murder was the only solution to her failing marriage. They played the recordings of her conversations with Cecilia Pierce, pointing out how she had subtly pressured those around her to stay silent. They called Billy Flynn to the stand, where he recounted in chilling detail how Pamela had seduced and controlled him, how she had made him believe they had a future together if only Greggory was out of the way. Flynn, no longer the naive boy who had been blinded by infatuation, now spoke with a mix of regret and clarity. He admitted his role in the crime, but made one thing abundantly clear: he never would have committed murder if it hadn't been for Pamela's influence. Other witnesses reinforced the prosecution's case. Latham Jr., Randall, and Fowler each testified, confirming the plan had been set in motion by Pamela. They described how she had assured them there was no other way, how she had coldly dictated the logistics of the killing. The defense fought back, but their strategy had weak foundations. They argued that the boys had acted independently, that Pamela had been framed. But with so many corroborating testimonies, their argument unraveled. Every claim of innocence was countered with hard evidence. Flynn's confession, Cecilia's wire recordings, the teenagers' detailed accounts of Pamela's involvement. The most damning moment came when prosecutors played the taped conversation between Pamela and Cecilia. While Pamela never outright admitted to planning the murder, her words left little doubt. Her veiled threats, her clear awareness that secrets needed to be kept, it was enough for the jury to see through her facade. When closing arguments concluded, there was little suspense about the outcome. On March 22, 1991, the jury deliberated for only 13 hours before returning with their verdict: guilty on all charges. Pamela Smart was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the judge read the sentence, Pamela's composure cracked for the first time. The reality of her fate settled in. This was the last time she would see freedom. The trial was over, but the legacy of the case would endure. It would be dissected in books, documentaries, and films for years to come. Pamela had believed she could manipulate everyone around her. But in the end, the truth had caught up to her. The courtroom doors closed behind her, but the story of Pamela Smart was far from over. She entered the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility in New York, her new reality settling in as the steel gates clanged shut behind her. The woman who once commanded attention with her confidence and charm was now just another inmate, stripped of the power she had wielded over those who had once been drawn to her. Prison was a brutal adjustment. Pamela, used to controlling her surroundings, now had no control at all. Her days were dictated by schedules she didn't set, her movements monitored, her privacy non-existent. The other inmates watched her with a mix of curiosity and contempt. Some saw her as a celebrity, the woman whose face had been plastered across newspapers and television screens. Others saw her as nothing more than another manipulator, someone who had played a deadly game and lost. At first, Pamela tried to maintain the same composed persona she had exhibited during her trial. She kept to herself, avoiding conflict, attempting to carve out a space where she could exist without drawing too much attention. But prison had its own hierarchy, its own rules, and Pamela was no exception to them. She was tested early. Inmates pushed her, challenging her, waiting to see if she would break. Violence was always a possibility, and she learned that lesson the hard way in 1996 when she was attacked by two fellow inmates. The assault was swift and brutal, leaving her battered and shaken. The message was clear. No matter how much media attention she had received inside these walls, she was just another prisoner. But Pamela was nothing if not resilient. She adapted. Over time, she found ways to survive. She threw herself into education, earning multiple degrees behind bars. She became involved in prison programs, working with other inmates, carving out a role for herself that gave her a sense of purpose. She gave interviews, continued to proclaim her innocence, and fought for appeals that never gained traction. The world outside moved on. Billy Flynn and his accomplices, sentenced as juveniles, were granted parole after serving decades behind bars. Flynn himself expressed remorse, acknowledging the devastating consequences of his actions. But Pamela remained behind bars. Her appeals rejected time and time again. As the years passed, interest in her case ebbed and flowed. Documentaries revisited the story. Journalists reached out for interviews, but nothing changed her reality. She was a woman who had believed she could manipulate fate, only to find herself trapped by the very web she had woven. Pamela Smart would spend the rest of her life in prison, the world that she once tried to control now reduced to the four walls of her cell. Her story had become a cautionary tale, a reminder of how deception, ambition, and manipulation could lead to irreversible consequences. Decades passed, but the name Pamela Smart remained etched in the public consciousness. Her story had become a textbook example of manipulation, betrayal, and the devastating consequences of misguided ambition. The scandal had long since faded from the daily news cycle, but every so often it resurfaced. through documentaries, books, and interviews dissecting the case that had captivated the nation. Inside Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, Pamela Smart clung to the last remnants of hope. She had spent years maintaining her innocence, arguing that she had never ordered her husband's murder, that Billy Flynn had acted on his own out of infatuation. But the courts had been unyielding. Every appeal was denied, every plea for reconsideration rejected. Time stripped away the illusion of control she once wielded. The young, ambitious woman who had confidently spoken to reporters during her trial was now a prisoner serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The outside world moved on. Billy Flynn and his accomplices were released after serving their time, free to rebuild their lives. Flynn, the boy she had once convinced to kill for her, was now a man, no longer trapped under her influence. By June 2024, Pamela made a rare public admission. In a statement that surprised many, she acknowledged responsibility. Not a full confession, not an outright admission of guilt, but a recognition that she had played a role in the events that led to her husband's death. She spoke of regret, of missed warnings, of the irreversible choices that had sealed her fate. But it was too late. The damage had been done. Greggory Smart was gone, and nothing could undo the pain his family had endured. In the end, there were no grand gestures, no last-minute reversals of fortune. Pamela Smart remained where she had been since 1991, behind bars serving a life sentence. The woman who had once believed she could manipulate her way to freedom had instead ensured her own permanent imprisonment. Her story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how ambition unchecked by morality could lead to destruction. The world no longer watched her with fascination, no longer debated her guilt or innocence. Time had rendered its final judgment. Pamela Smart would die in prison, her fate sealed by the very choices she had made. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the story. Don't forget to hit that like button if you found the content interesting, and feel free to leave a comment below if you have any unanswered questions. And of course, don't forget to subscribe for more compelling stories like this one. See you in the next video.